Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You're listening to a new episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore. We are all lifelong learners, and nowhere is this more relevant than in the practice of leadership. Our goal is continual learning and improvement. Let's get after it. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore. We've got a very special guest today, and Danielle Posa. We're going to have a great conversation around well-being and its relation to leadership. But let me introduce Danielle first, as she's the founder of Workplace Wellbeing Advisors. One of her titles, I might add, as founder, and hopefully we'll unpack some of the other titles. But Danielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to talk about this.
Appreciate you being on. And I recall from our preemptive or pre-conversations that your background's really interesting. And I hope that we have enough time to tease back some of the elements there for this particular conversation. So tell us a little bit about yourself, starting with Workplace Wellbeing Advisors, how you started that, and maybe a little bit of background.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, at a high level, what I do is I'm super passionate about well-being. You know, basically all things well-being, all things that lead to a thriving and fulfilling life. But I've always been interested in the intersection between well-being and workplaces, because the workplace is where we spend most of our time, and it's part of our identity, and it's really can be a place where we can achieve our potential, right? If it's the right kind of work. So I work with organizations really at a high level with executive teams to help them make well-being a part of their culture, right? And so creating a strategy that is really a long-term strategy, not just a well-being program or a wellness program, but how do you make well-being a real core part of how your business operates and part of the entire employee life cycle. So that's what I do. That's what I do now.
So let's focus in on the term well-being, because that probably means lots of different things for folks. What does it mean in the context of what you bring to the table?
So I always say well-being is most synonymous with quality of life, right? Like I don't use it interchangeably with wellness or happiness or mental health or work-life balance. It's really about when you have high well-being, that means you have a high quality of life, right? So what we're really aiming, if we have a high quality of life, that means that we've lived a life that's fulfilling, where work-life balance is a part of that, where happiness, of course, is a part of that. But the end result is that high well-being is really feeling like, just feeling good, really good about that, your life overall.
So is it fair to say we're talking about the intersection of all of those different things that we carry with us, from engagement to engagement, interaction to interaction? It might be personal matters, work matters, your aspirations for the future, that kind of thing. Certainly.
Yes. I started my consulting career at Gallup before I started my own business. And I often use the framework from Gallup, which touches on these 5 elements of well-being, which includes work, relationships, finances, your health, and your community. So yes, everything you just mentioned, those are the 5 areas that contribute to, your quality of life.
I like that framework. I'm not familiar with it, but it seems to immediately jump out at you as those things that are important to you, right? The relationships, work, family, personal relationships, that kind of thing. So cool. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about how you got started professionally. And I want to carve out some time to talk about the jump to becoming a founder and starting your own thing, because if we key in on the topic of leadership and really are able to pull back the thread on it, I'm very much interested in the idea of the position that people find themselves in, that like push them to say, hey, I'm going to put my own shingle and do this. The passions involved and all that kind of stuff. But how'd you get started professionally?
Well, then I'll actually start. So a lot of times I start with saying, kind of Gallup was my more official start to my career, because that was my first job out of college. But for the sake of that question, I'll actually go back a little further. So when I was 19 in college, I always loved entrepreneurship. I always thought I would start my own business ever since I was a little kid. When I was 19, I took a sales job because I said to myself, either I could be like a lifeguard during my winter break, or I can like I can maybe do something in sales and make more money and do something that's more entrepreneurial. And so I did that, and I broke a national record that first month in sales. But that was kind of the jumping off point in my career, because sales, I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a lot about motivation and understanding yourself and developing relationships with people. And I ended up doing some self-development work, which had me get very clear on what my mission and my purpose was at a very young age, like really clear. And that's actually what then led me to Gallup, because it was the only company that I applied for and interviewed for, because it was the only company I wanted to work for. And then I got the job there, and that led to kind of the rest of my career journey.
So that kind of focus that you just described, I have found it, especially in a leadership journey, to be essential, like keying in on something that you think is going to be both, beneficial to your development, that you're going to get something out of the experience. Is that something that's a natural component of your personality, or is it something like that you can trace maybe back to childhood?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually would say it's more of a function of a sense of purpose, because I think that, yes, there are some people that are more focused than others, and that can be just like a natural talent or a strength. But I think when you get connected to what you really care about making a difference in your life, it starts to just like pull you in a direction, whereas you don't have to kind of, force yourself to go down. I almost feel like the nature of my work, has been, I don't really have to try to focus in a sense. It just has, like most of my work, I felt like one thing just kind of led to the next. And it was just, again, it wasn't like when I saw Gallup's site, I was just like, I'm going to get this job because I'm so focused. And this is what it was like. I just felt so connected to what the mission of the organization was about. And there were so many elements of it that resonated with me that it just felt like the natural step forward. And the reason why I think that's important is because sometimes like focus can feel like work, like, oh, I just need to focus on this, or I just, I got to stop being distracted. But what I've always been such a believer in the power of your sense of purpose, because what that can do is actually helps you naturally know the next steps to take in life without having to figure it out, without having to force yourself to focus. So did I answer your question?
No, absolutely. I mean, a little bit of it is embracing the things that you're passionate about and letting them guide the way in terms of where you head professionally. And it's important to tease that out, because I think that's part of the element that goes into you probably naturally being an entrepreneur, because not everybody has those qualities where they say, this thing gets me up in the morning. This is how I want to spend my time. This is what I want to invest and pour into and eventually hopefully succeed in. And I assume that, there's probably a conversation you have with yourself and others, close family members, when you make the decision to sort of strike out on your own. What's that look like for you from an entrepreneurial standpoint?
Well, I always remember hearing that really good entrepreneurs take calculated risks. And that always resonated with me, because some people would be like, oh, well, you're just really risk averse and you'll just kind of, and I'm like, well, I'm not somebody who just, jumps off cliffs left and right. Like I do feel like, the nature of how I've gone about things have been calculated, risky, but calculated. Like, can I see how this is going to pan out? Or if I do X, like I know this is risky, but there's like, I've kind of, analyzed things a bit first. But yeah, I mean, when I first, I was at Gallup for 4 years before I decided to leave. I didn't really involve anyone else in the conversations in terms of them, being part of that decision. It was something that was very natural to me. My father was an entrepreneur, his whole life. And my parents were never, my dad was always like, you should do what makes you happy. He just always preached that. So it was never the kind of thing where I had to get anybody's approval to do it. Mm-hmm. When I left Gallup, what happened was I was in conversations with multiple people at the time. That was when my passion for well-being and well-being in the workplace really started to bubble up. And I started to realize I want to just focus exclusively on this. And I was speaking with somebody who was the CEO of a company who said, look, if you want to really do this work full time, he said, I will pay you at least what you're making at Gallup as a consultant and work for us part time. So I was like, sign me up, So that was, it was a perfect transition, it was that calculated risk because it was such a great, way to transition into my own business. It was a form of stable income while also being a client and not where I had to be an employee. And that was kind of how it got started.
So I was going to ask you, you may have already answered this. I mean, did you have examples? And it sounds like you did, maybe on your father and others, of entrepreneurs who had successfully led their lives in that same spirit?
Yeah. I mean, my dad definitely, I spent a lot of time with my father growing up. He was he was actually the distributor for the Daily News in Queens in New York. So was a paper boy when he was 11 years old, and was just hustling, at an early age. And then he bought his first real estate property with a lot of the money he made from being in the newspaper. At the age of 19, he bought his first home, which I think it was the same house that I was actually born in, or not born in, but where we lived when I was born. And he took me to he would bring me to different real estate properties to work. And he always would explain things to me and talk to me about kind of just he had these motivational quotes always hanging up on the wall. And so he was probably the main kind of influence in terms of entrepreneurship. But I did remember reading that, one of the interesting things about entrepreneurship is they say that it is an innate thing, that it really is kind of a part of who you are. It's not really something that gets taught, which is probably a controversial, thought in today's world, because I think everybody, thinks that they can and should be an entrepreneur. Right. But I do feel like it was kind of just part of who I was, because when I was 5 years old, I was charging my mom's friends to paint their nails and stuff. I said, come downstairs and all. And I used to take junk from around the house and put price tags on it and sell it out of our basement when I was I was under 10.
So the seed started early. Would it be safe to say that maybe both parents, but in particular your dad, is he your first identifying leader in your life, the first person that you sort of look to as someone in the leadership realm?
Yeah, that's I've never been asked that before. Yeah, I think so. Maybe I didn't, even subconsciously, it wasn't even something, but yeah, because I did, really look up to him. I did take what he said very, very seriously. So yeah, I would say
so,
it was.
You decide in this environment to sort of strike off on your own. You have this agreement that you're going to come on board at a minimum, existing or sort of doing what it is that you were doing in a financial capability or rate at the time. And then you think how you're going to expound off of that and build it into something else. Talk to me a little bit about the role that leadership plays in the subject of well-being. How do you view the topics? Are they intermingled in terms of how you view them, or do you view the topic of leadership separate from the idea of well-being?
No, so I think it goes hand in hand, right? So it depends on how we define leadership, because there are plenty of people in leadership positions who don't really demonstrate, in my opinion, real qualities of leaders, right? So to me, real leadership means being connected to something bigger than yourself, having a sense of purpose for your leadership, being connected to the impact that you have on other people and wanting to have a positive impact, on people's lives. And so if you look at it according to that definition, well-being and workplace well-being go hand in hand because, hey, like I do consulting. I'm not running a major organization on a daily basis, but if I was, I would want to know at any given time during the life cycle of that business, like what exactly is the state of well-being of my people right now, and down to a very specific level, because there's kind of that interest in, yes, we want to grow the business, but hey, if there's like pockets of people who are really struggling or really suffering, like that, first of all, I care about that. Second of all, I know that's going to have an impact on what we're doing. So to me, those two things are not just connected. They are like intricately, leadership and well-being are intricately connected.
Yeah. So I'm glad you went down this lane. So
would it always go down this lane.
Well, no, I mean, would it be safe to say that even good leaders, I think, may sometimes lose sight of what you just described as this important thing? You described it like you want to know down to probably the level of every employee, like how they're feeling about the experience. And then oftentimes in leadership, there's this big pull to get things done, to accomplish things, to like drive the entire team to move forward. How do you think leaders should consciously think about taking those necessary pauses so that they can get a pulse of the team to make sure that everyone's coming along at a rate that, that allows them to thrive and be who they need to be? Like how should we think about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the pause was the first part of it. So like I said, I told you, I was just on Deepak Chopra and I were just on a webinar right before this, talking about conscious leadership and how, the problem of our society, I think, and of our time is the lack of conscious behavior, meaning like we are constantly doing. Deepak always says we're human doings and not human beings. And so we are all like struggling with just, being in this, like, what did you do for me lately type culture, and just getting things done, getting to the bottom of email lists and to-do lists, and not taking that step back. And I think the first thing is like, we have to remind ourselves that at the end of life, we're going to be like wondering and saying to ourselves like, oh man, I wish I like just took a second to just interrupt that pattern and really think about what direction I want to have all of this doing going in, right? Like if I'm going to be doing all the time, and at least let me make sure it's actually headed, towards the kind of things that I want to achieve in my life, right? And that the things that I'm really going to be proud of. So what you just said about pausing, like we have to get better at that, right? Whether that's through meditation, whether that's through actually sitting down and just like having lunch without multitasking and just contemplating things and thinking, and not just using that space for scrolling through social media, like reading with a book in our hand without distractions, and then, when you start there, then all of a sudden you have insights about like what maybe solutions start to come to you as in terms of challenges you're facing as a leader that would never have come to you if we were just busy answering emails and frantically trying to cross things off your to-do list. I've experienced that many times where like when I've, meditated and I come out and I'm like, oh, that's how I can like solve that problem. And like all of a sudden it's just right there because I'm getting connected to, to like more of my soul, or a place that the answers can come a lot more easily than when I'm sitting in front of my screen with a million tabs open and emails to answer and all of that. Right. So the first step is that you have to actually get connected and really ask yourself some of these bigger questions. When it comes to really looking at, well-being at that granular level that I mentioned, that's a way bigger, it's not like every leader is doing that. And, it's not like the CEO of a company is looking at those kinds of results on a daily basis, but like I build long-term well-being strategies.
I would say most are not.
Right. No, most of them are not. But like when I build well-being strategies with companies, it's about the fact that, you actually want that information to trickle down to teams. So each team can feel like they have a sense of how is the well-being of our team doing, where a manager knows, how is the engagement of this team? What do we need to work on? But it becomes something that is an underlying intention of the organization, right? That is worked on a consistent but long-term basis. It's not like a one item, to do. It's not like one item on your to-do list. It's a pretty big undertaking.
So this theme of pausing, this theme of self-reflection, something I've written about in the Leadership Student blog that I keep going, or the newsletter on LinkedIn. And it's also part of conversations I've had with other leaders about how important it is. I would put, actions like journaling as a viable sort of step that folks might take to pause. You mentioned meditating. Are there other, specific things that people can do to initiate that pause that you think are helpful?
Yeah. So I think one thing is that it is important to find out which one of these things is more of your style, right? So, so I work closely with, I think it's funny that I'm like citing him on this, but his name is Jeff McDonald. He was the former global head of HR for Unilever, right? And this guy is so committed to well-being, and he is a major like mountain bike rider, and he is just constantly on his bike, right, out in nature. And that, like, for him, that's like his meditation, right? That is his way of connecting and getting, more clear on really his mission in life. For other people, they love meditation. I know a lot of people, it's challenging for them to do. I think, meditation is something that is some really we all need to get good at least just sitting still quietly and not doing anything, right? Yeah. But yes, I mean, journaling, I think, like, for me, reading is a big one. I love to just sit outside, with a book. And I find that it spurs creativity and reflection, especially when I leave my phone off to the side. So any form of being outside in nature, for sure. There's a concept called soft fascination. Have you ever heard that before?
I haven't.
It's one of my favorite concepts. So what it is like, it's what happens to you when you're staring at like a fire or waves. So when you're staring at something that is consistent but changing slightly, it creates this like dynamic in the mind and the brain of like a sense of calm, but enough focus where you're actually fascinated, because if you think of a flickering fire, it's always kind of changing, right?
Right.
But it's consistent, so it creates this like calmness where you can just kind of like sit there and stare and daydream. So I bring that up because that's the impact that like nature or waves and things have on us. It gives us this ability to kind of zone out for a bit, but also maybe have points of reflection kind of come in, or deep thoughts. Another one that I would put on the list, I mean, definitely journaling, practicing gratitude, saying thanks like before meals, and just, I think just proper acknowledgement of people in general is one of them. But playing an instrument, I grew up playing the piano, and it's something that I still do sometimes. I have 2 little kids, so not as much as I would like to, but that's something where, again, I can't be multitasking when I do it. It's something that, kind of enables me to just take a bit of a pause. But whatever it is, it's a matter of finding something that is your style so that you're more likely to actually engage in the practice, not so much just trying to do it because you think you should.
Think you should. Yeah. No, I love that point. And hopefully that's the point that the audience takes away, because I recently, through conversation, got back into journaling. I had missed it for many, many years. And a conversation just like this one retuned me to how much I enjoyed it. And I'm also a hobbyist musician. So I get what you're saying about.
Oh, cool. What do you play?
I play the drums. And I actually, recently, within the past year, built myself a music studio just with a kid in it, and I can go in there and for, a span of, 2 hours or so, just completely detach, and it's so
right.
it's so
Yeah.
cathartic.
It probably totally re-energizes you, right?
Completely re-energized. It's almost like, clearing the cache in a
Yes.
computer, right?
Yeah. And then you come back and you're like, oh, why did I think all those, emails were so important? It's like, doesn't seem as much of a big, but that is what happens, right? When we take the time to do these things, like all of a sudden the things that we thought were just like so important and so urgent, we like realize that by making that time and carving that time for ourselves, we remind ourselves that we are in control of our lives and that we are making those decisions, as opposed to just being a reactionary like machine, towards life. Like I call it being stuck in the automaticness of life. Like that is happening to, I think, so many people, most of us.
Yeah, most of us. Yeah.
And then what happens? You're on your deathbed and you're like, what the F did I do all those years? Right. It just like goes by in a flash. It was all unconscious. And, maybe not all of it, but a good chunk of it. And you just say to yourself, I wish I was more conscious in the midst of all that, craziness.
From everything I've heard, in those moments, it's the relationships that you're either lamenting that you didn't have, or that's really the dominating thing. It's about the relationships that you did have and what they meant to you. None of those actions of doing are the things that people are like, well, I didn't do enough at work. No one's saying that.
Yeah. There's a book called The 5 Regrets of the Dying that talks about all of that.
No. Outstanding. So I want to venture into, and I try to as best I can, and in this environment, talk a little bit about what leadership looks like for sometimes with a gender bent to it. So I'm interested in your observations. It's like, oh, he's opening Pandora's box.
No, I like Pandora's box.
I'm interested in just maybe some top level observations you have about the difficulties that maybe women have in, both self-imposed and maybe obstacles that are in front of them in terms of how they lead in the workplace. And then I'm sure I'm open.
Let me get my list. Okay, yeah. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because, I'm not really like I don't classify myself as like a feminist. And the reason why I don't, I feel like inherently maybe I am, but I don't like to say that or classify myself that way, because what concerns me is that it can tend to create even more of almost like a us versus them, feeling in, kind of like in the world. And sometimes, men can, whatever. Innately, that's not the intent. The intent is,
no,
I'm not saying that it is. I'm just prefacing it because I think innately I actually am, in the sense. So like when a lot of all of this started to become really clear for me once I had my children, because I said I have a son that's 1.5 and I have a daughter that's 4.5. And I've often felt super torn, because on the one side, I'm like this really kind of like driven, more type A type business persona.
Go get it.
On the other side, I believe so strongly in like conscious parenting. And I've read so much material on that. I had my son at home. Like I had a home birth. Like I breastfed my daughter until she was 2 years old. So I believe in, and often those two things, absolutely, like those two personas do not go hand in hand. I mean, you cannot, it's so challenging because we try to say like, oh, women should be able to have it all. But like, if you really want to do life right, you really can't have it all, especially not at the same time. Meaning that, for the most part, my husband, who's very hands-on, like with our kids, as much as when we had the kids, like he takes a step back to an extent, supporting me and taking some time off and all that. But the trajectory of a man's life and their kind of career is just, for the most part, it's almost uninterrupted. Maybe it's kind of like your career's going like this, and it's a little bit like it slows down, like you have the kids and stuff. But, as a woman, it was like so challenging, because even now, we pay for a nanny. My son's only a year and a half, because I said to myself, I know it would be easier if we just like either paid for daycare, or it would be cheaper and stuff. But I'm like, I want to be able to see my kid during breaks, like throughout the day. And that has an impact, because look, I still don't want to work a full time. I still don't want to work 8 hours, because I want time with him in the morning and I want some time at night. I don't want to rush into like having dinner and just going to sleep and not like spending any time with my kids. That means that my work day, I am shorting my work day down. Now that's my choice, but I say to myself, if I want like not to have regrets, I'm like, I'm doing that,
making those conscious choices. Yeah.
Yes. And then if you don't do that as a woman, if you are like, well, I don't have that choice, I don't run my own business, I have to go to the office, I have to work 8 to 10 hour days, and I'm just tucking my kid in at night, then you live with mom guilt. You have this feeling, and that's where this mental health issue that we see in women and mothers comes in. And they say that postpartum depression is at least a 2-year stint for most, or just postpartum, elements in general. And so if you think about that, then when you're going into the workplace, you've got all these things, right? Like on your mind as a woman, you're worrying about your kids, you're feeling guilty, you've got this anxiety. So yeah, I think there's these different layers as a woman. I'm just talking about one that relates to, having children.
Right.
But, then you think about, there's other aspects, which is like what it takes to have children and the issues that women are going through with, fertility. And then there's when you're trying to climb that corporate ladder and you can tell that somebody is having a meeting with you because of the way that you look and not because of what the meeting is about, and I've been there many, many times. So there is like, when you break down these different types of challenging, it's quite a lot of them.
It's a struggle. It's an uphill battle, right?
Yeah. And I think the only way to really get around that is that there does need to be some societal shifts that need to happen. I think if we weren't living in such a rat race type environment, if things were more of this slowing, we wouldn't feel the need to like be catching up as much as women. If we lived in more of an environment that was kind of, respecting more work-life balance.
Right.
So anyway, as you could see, I can get on my soapbox about that pretty quickly.
And that's good. I think that, the observations that you make about the challenges really it breaks open, just like you said, one aspect of it, in terms of, being parents and how involved you want to be, the 24-hour day, the cycle, there's only so many awake hours, so many hours to do things. And when you have children, the idea of sort of now, how do I maintain that work-life balance? How do I spend time interacting with them? I think certainly we're all challenged with that for those of us that have kids, but I think especially women are particularly challenged with that. And it can, I think, make, the corporate ascent, it can make it feel impossible. I think in some instances, and not everybody's position.
Yeah. I mean, I've had employee interviews with women who have said like, there is no way I can continue my job in this like engineering industry and have children. Like they're like, I cannot keep up with the path that these men are on. And if I have children, I'm not going to be able to keep up with this workload. I'm going to take a step back. If I go on that maternity leave, if I take sufficient time off, there's just no way. And to the point where they're like crying over that notion, because how do you make that, you're making this decision between being like your success as a career and have like, that's such a huge choice, like to make in your life. And it's one that has an lasting impact, so.
As someone who's been successful at managing it, what are the characteristics you think need to be present in, our women leaders in order to embrace sort of this idea that there are decisions that have to be made, and there's because of those decisions there will be impact in the various portions of their lives. Like, what characteristics are important to highlight those things? Because what you see most time is women just trying to do everything and trying to juggle things, and you don't get to look behind the curtain in all of those instances, but I'm sure that there are many challenges in sort of trying to engage all of it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to kind of unpack there, but I mean, first, there's just from a more tactical level, like the only reason why I have been able to balance things more is because of the fact that I make my own hours and I decide, how I'm going to go. So I think, especially with all the stuff around flexible work, one of the places that makes a major impact is on mothers, especially mothers who are expecting or who have young children. So if you're a lead, if you're a leader in an organization, especially a woman leader, understanding that, who you're talking to when it comes to that flexibility and saying, like, I know you got the little ones at home, like that is, and that you being able to, be at home or pick them up or do those things. So that's one thing, but it's setting the example. It's being vulnerable about, your own challenges as a woman or your own motherhood. One of the things the challenges that I see is that in the older generations, they came from more of that, like, well, I just had to leave after 3 months and I just had to go to work. And sometimes they can't totally relate with this more of like conscious parenting lifestyle that a lot of the younger generations want to take up. And so there's got to be room for some, open dialogue and some vulnerability to really, really understand the nuances of what women are going through and what they're striving for and like what their goals are. But I guess the short answer to your question is just like vulnerability and authentic conversations. I think it needs to start there.
And that vulnerability, I suspect in your estimation, requires some amount of self-awareness in order to be able to effectively understand maybe goals, limitations. I don't know what happens when you make those decisions. Yeah.
I mean, because sometimes vulnerability is confused with weakness, right? I mean, and if say you are a woman leader, you have to realize that if you have a younger workforce, they're looking to you to say, oh, can I see myself in that position? And a lot of them are saying, no, I can't. I don't really want to do what she did. I don't want to climb the corporate ladder, just stay in this one job for that long of a period. And they have to be able to relate to you in some way. Right. And if you just kind of seem like this distant leader, it's not, there's just no way to create that bond. So being vulnerable to me really does go hand in hand with being authentic. It doesn't mean, you're breaking down crying in conversations and it's not a weakness thing. It's actually showing that, what things need to be said to have an impact. And you're speaking from a place where that your intention is to impact somebody by speaking your truth,
authenticity, right? Yeah. Hey, you touched on the flexibility component. I mean, this new paradigm that we're all living in, remote life, remote work, combinations thereof that are a part of now the current workplace environment. Certainly there's some positives in terms of being able to manage your life and work and maybe better work-life balance with this hybrid environment that we're in. But there's also got to be some negatives, I think, in terms of well-being. And can we tie those negatives into now what leaders need to sort of be on the lookout for in terms of, what used to be persistent engagement with your employees now amounts to, maybe a single half-hour video call a week.
Right.
How do you know what's going on with folks, and if that's the extent of your contact with them?
Yeah. So I do believe, the hybrid is best, and there is research that backs this up. There was some great research that came from Gallup around this. But first of all, the one size doesn't fit all. I mean, that's the thing, is that people have to stop thinking like, oh, okay, there's going to be one what works in one company or industry might be a little bit, different. You might need more of the in-person collaborations. You need more in-office time. So I say this more so that like, no matter what, you need to have a flexible work policy. You need to really figure out what works best, not just for your organization, but on a team by team basis, right? Teams and managers have to kind of, get a sense of like what works and be in tune with those people. There's definitely a value to being in the office, to feeling the sense of the culture, to seeing people bumping into them, having spontaneous conversations, having more casual chit chat with people. To your point, like there's a lot of bonding moments that can happen from being there. And sometimes, employees don't know what's best for them, right? Like some people who are, who feel like, oh, I just want to be home, are some employees who are retreating, who maybe are already lonely and just don't feel like kind of getting out. And they say that they'd rather stay home, but then don't realize when they're in the office and they're seeing people and it actually adds like a pep in their step, right? So it's challenging because sometimes like what people say is not actually necessarily what is in their best interest from a well-being and engagement standpoint. That said, I think it kind of goes into your next question, which is, how are you actually getting to know people in these like fleeting interactions on these virtual calls and, quick exchanges. And I think that like managers and leaders have to have different types of interactions with different intentions, meaning that, when we are in the office, maybe once a quarter, twice a year, we actually go to lunch. Like we use that time of being in the office to get to know each other better, to like sit down, ask some deeper questions, ask what life is really like for that employee, because you're not going to be able to cover that in a quick check-in call. Right. And that's a challenge that then we're like, oh, within the check-in calls, how do we like ask people, how are you? But really, how are you? And it's like, well, if you really care about that answer, you're not going to cover that and everything on your like your to-do list in like a 20 to 30 minute check-in call with your employees.
It's a 29 minute, 30 second call. And then the last 30 seconds, how you doing?
Right. Or vice versa. How are you doing? And it's 29 minutes. And then, by the way, here are the priorities that we have to get through this week. But if you know that like, oh, I have this like lunch that we do, like clockwork every quarter, we use that as an opportunity to get to know each other better. Now you've built a foundation of, kind of trust and, a relationship. So with those check-in calls, it's okay for them to be more transactional because you've kind of taken some time to actually like build the relationship, right? So I think it's thinking about like, what is the best use of in-office time and in-person time versus virtual? I don't think we've kind of thought through that layer of the strategy enough.
I have some ideas around it, and it has to do with small team leadership and building high performing teams. And I'm convinced that there is a period of direct contact that's needed, not only at the initial stand up of the team, but as you were describing, periodic, intentional, like face-to-face engagements that are required if you expect people to build the kinds of bonds that ultimately lead to high performance.
Really what we get from in-person, we're human beings. We're not meant to we like have a body and a physicality for a reason. We're not just supposed to be like on screens. It's like, if we wanted to hang out with our best friend, are we going to just like invite them to a Zoom conversation? Or do we want to like hang out with them on the couch and like talk to them? And like when you're having an important conversation with them, you want to sit next to them and see their body language and get a sense of them. I mean, if we realize that there is that value, right, in that type of communication and being in each other's presence, we realize that is having that type of an impact in ways that we aren't necessarily conscious of all of the time, right? So we have to like trust that there is a reason why getting, out there in person with people, seeing like that makes sense. It sounds even crazy that we have to explain this, doesn't it? I mean, it's kind of insane.
Yeah, it does. So with most of my guests, I end up ending the conversation around a discussion of whether or not leaders are born or made. And I'm interested in hearing your opinion on this theory. I'm sure you've heard the question posed before.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think you can, I think maybe some of the great leaders out there are, a combination of just having, some type of a natural talent, or being a natural visionary, or having a natural talent for wanting to develop other people, again, depends on your definition of what a leader actually is. But, when I've done, as I mentioned, I've done like a lot of self-development, in my life. And I've seen people who have transformed from being like, jerks to being really committed to people in their organization or making an impact. But they're made if they really are committed and invest. That was part of our conversation with Deepak, is that we talked about how, there has to be that like desire and commitment to almost like train yourself, to be that type of a leader. And there aren't, many people making the time, to our point at the beginning, like making the time, investing the time and the energy and effort, carving it out of their busy schedules to say, this is really important to do for myself, for my own legacy, and for the impact that I'm, having on other people.
Hence,
why are you making that facial?
Hence the title of this entire thing, the podcast, and the whole theme I have around being in leadership. It's about being a continuous student, continuous ongoing learning. It is a discipline. It requires you to invest time and effort in terms of developing yourself, and you have to be committed to that in order to see progress.
Yes, like you could ask yourself, like, am I a leader? Like, just like contemplate on that. And like, am I a leader just because maybe I have SVP in my title? Or like, does that actually make me a leader? Right. What is the answer to that question? Like, how do you answer that question for yourself? Like, well, actually, I don't really feel like I'm a leader until I am practicing X, or until I embody these, qualities, right? Or until I have this type of impact. But it kind of starts with that, question.
Absolutely. How can folks get in touch with you if they're interested in taking you up on the workplace well-being?
Well, my website is workplacewellbeingadvisors.com. On LinkedIn, I'm pretty active. So if you message me on LinkedIn, I'm there as well. But yeah, you can get in touch with me through the website.
Okay. Love it. And love the conversation, Danielle. Appreciate you joining us here on the Leadership Student Podcast. Folks, that's it for this session of the Leadership Student. We will continue to have conversations like this about the different aspects of leadership, all of the ingredients, as I like to say, that go into building out good leaders. And we look forward to seeing you guys on the next Leadership Student Podcast. Take care.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore, part of the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the ITSP Magazine YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.